Just when you thought we had reached the end of authentication protocols, no, we have more. Radius and TACACS, they're on deck for today's episode starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV, and we are getting into more authentication protocols, specifically Radius, and another awesome one called TACACS. We're not making this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. This is actual protocols you will need to know for the Security Plus exam. I give it over to my good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes,
All right.
where do we start?
Well, we'll go ahead and we'll start with the first one that you mentioned. We're going to start with another authentication protocol. Like Dan says, there's definitely a handful of them that we need to be aware of, and we decided to break them up so, we could spend a little bit of time in each one. And the one that we're going to spend some time in first here is something known as Radius. Now, let's go ahead and set the stage. You all have enough acronyms out there, and like Dan said, we can't make this stuff up. Some of it's so good. This is what's known as the Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. This is an authentication mechanism, or protocol, if you will, that's been around for a very long time. And it's an open standard. It's one of the reasons it is so popular today because, well, it's very mature. It's been around for a long time, so everybody's using it. And because it's an open standard, you don't have to pay proprietary royalties to somebody to implement it. So I definitely want you to keep that in mind as being an industry standard. I also want you to know that it uses UDP ports. Now, that's going to be a little bit more important coming up when we talk about the next one, TACACS. And then we'll do a comparison of why I actually mentioned that. Now, when we talk about using UDP ports, I've got about 4 of them I need you to be aware of. All right. There's older ports for more legacy, remote, or Radius servers. I'm not even going to try to say that 100 times. Radius servers. And there's some newer ports. And I say newer ports, they've been around for a bit now too. Again, because this is a very old protocol. Those ports, all right, you will see ports 1812 and ports 1813. Authentication request will do 1812, and the accounting part of that we'll talk about is going to be port 1813. There are other older ports too. You might see ports 1645 and 1646. I don't know which one you're going to see. In fact, if you were to implement Radius through Windows Network Policy Server, there is an option for both of those ports. So they are there depending on what you're supporting. So what does it allow us to do? Well, we've been talking about things like identity, we've been talking about authentication, right? Well, authentication's even in the name here. But what this allows us to accomplish is centralizing something known as AAA. All right, now AAA, we joked around before that we're not talking about a third-party car insurance. This is not going to help you if you have a flat tire on the side of the road.
I thought it was a baseball reference.
It very well could be. That's right. Well, it's a AAA league. This is the minor league.
Right.
But that is the authentication, the authorization, and accounting. So remember, it allows us to authenticate, right, determine what you're authorized to do, as well as auditing. And I still agree with Dan. I like the auditing term, but accounting. Determining what people have done within your networks.
You think they create the acronym before they actually fill in the words for that? Like, I think Radius would be cool.
That's right.
Well, let's just make it fit. I know that. No, but there are some components to actually making Radius work. It's not just this client-server kind of model. There's some moving parts to this, right?
Yeah, at its core, it's client server, but it isn't just a client server. Which I love the way you put that. It is, and it isn't. So let's go ahead and show you what the components are that Dan's talking about here. So we're going to start out with something known as an access client, right? They couldn't just say somebody needing to authenticate, but this is what's known as an access client, and you have a Radius server. Now, you have what are known as Radius clients. The reason I kind of joke around about this is I remember when I was first studying this, I was thinking Radius clients, right? You're using Radius authentication. That means I need to authenticate. I'm the Radius client, right? And that's not really the case. If I'm needing to do Radius authentication and I'm typing in my username and password, believe it or not, I'm the access client. And just keep that in mind for your exam when it comes to what pieces are being implemented here, because the Radius clients are these components right here. Now, think about the days of dial-up. When I said this has been around for a very long time, how many of you out there right now are using dial-up? Probably not, because you wouldn't be watching this video very well, right?
It'd be real choppy.
That's right. Now, I have had people tell me, well, wait a second, do we even still use dial-up? You bet we do. Not every country in the world, not every location has more modern communication infrastructure built in, right? But phones have been around for a very long time. So the PSTN-based networks are still very, very used.
And that's considered critical infrastructure as well. Like
is.
that is something that we keep and is first and foremost brought back online in case of something like a natural disaster, right?
You know, and I know you and Don, I actually learned that from Don, and I'm going to kind of build on this because I know you and Don worked together in, I believe it was an insurance company,
Yeah.
right? And he said, because I asked him the same question, I was like, Don, one of our other edutators here, I said, Don, do we really still use dial-up? And he said that exact thing. He said in disasters where your Ethernet, your SONA ATM-based networks all fail, guess what? Chances are you still got phone lines, so they would bring in banks of modems to establish connection to critical communication infrastructure to keep it up and running. So yes, it is used, and I'm glad you brought that up. And it kind of brings me back to that first question I had. Are people still using dial-up? But I digress from here. We'll go ahead and what happens here is when we make a connection, or we make a connection request, it's an authentication request. The access request, however you want to say that, is going to go to one of these Radius clients. Now, the Radius clients are called that because then what they do is they take that access request and they generate what's known as a Radius message, and they send it off to the Radius server. Now remember, the Radius server is doing authentication, it's doing authorization, and it's also doing the, hey, I'm going to keep track of what you are doing, right? So what it's going to do is it's either going to authenticate, it's going to send back a Radius challenge, and one of two things can happen. You're either going to be allowed in, or you're going to be denied. Because what happens now is the Radius server generates what's known as a Radius challenge. All right, it's just as simple as, hey, I'm a Radius server. I'm going to generate this message that tells you in the Radius language, prove you are who you say you are. That goes back through the Radius client, sent back to the access client. That has a whole bunch of technical jargon for saying, hey, I need to connect. Prove you are who you say you are. I type a password in. Now, if you meet the Radius challenge, that means you've typed the right username and password in, you get let into the network, right? And again, your privileges or permissions are going to be determined based on, you know, who you are, what your role is in the company, or you might type the password like I do, especially on Mondays early in the morning, wrong 5 times. And in that case, you're not going to gain access. You'll either be re-challenged or the connection will be completely dropped. It really just depends on what the network policies, connection request policies are on the Radius server. So those are the components, if you will, inside of Radius and a little bit about what Radius is.
Yeah, it's really helpful, especially with the diagram to help clear up how this works, because there are a lot of very, what's the word, confusing pieces of terminology that could really trip you up on the exam. So make sure this is something that you study and get familiar with for your exam. Now let's move on to TACACS,
Sure.
because it is super fun to say, right? It's just so much, right? But it's kind of like Radius, if I'm not mistaken.
It really is. So when we look at something like TACACS, all right, big long name for Terminal Access Control System, or Terminal Access Controller, I should say, Access Control System. Do you need to know that acronym for the exam? I doubt it. Doubt it highly.
CompTIA does a good job of actually like spelling out acronyms in there.
They really do. And at this point, they're not trying to say, hey, I just need you to do a vocab dump. What I need you to do, and I say I, like the exam's going to speak to you, I need you to prove you know what this is. All right, so TACACS, and more specifically what we use, and it's not in the diagram, is TACACS Plus today because there are variants. All right, but here's the difference between Radius and TACACS. All right, Radius is an open standard for doing AAA. TACACS, on the other hand, is Cisco proprietary. All right, now, there's a caveat to that. The original TACACS, which is completely, it's not used anymore, there's versions of TACACS, that's Cisco proprietary. The TACACS I want you to know for the exam is TACACS Plus, and there are other variants too that I don't even want you to worry about for the exam, but I do want you to know TACACS Plus today is an open standard. All right, it was originally designed by Cisco, but Cisco led it over and said, okay, people can build on it today. But what it does is it allows you to separate the AAA roles, right? In a Radius server, all 3 of those roles are performed by the same server. The authorization, or the authentication, the authorization, the accounting, all of that's bundled into one server. With TACACS, you get the ability to separate the roles, which typically means more infrastructure, you pay more money. So it's going to be an expensive implementation, which is one of the reasons Radius really is more popular today, just because of the fact that it's an open standard, widely adopted, and again, doesn't require a lot of this extra infrastructure. Now, it differs in a couple of ways, and I'll tell you, Dan, towards the end of this, what we'll do is we'll put a little table up here, and we'll compare these again so you can kind of see them back and forth. Is unlike Radius. The TACACS Plus protocol uses TCP. All right. Now, why does that make a difference? All right. If you remember your Network Plus communications, right, UDP is a connectionless protocol, right? It doesn't verify. At best, you get a checksum that says, yeah, that's bad, throw it out. TCP, on the hand, is a stateful connection-oriented protocol, which we're going to make sure that we have established a session, the packets are tracked, sequence broke down, and then the session is terminated. And if something's wrong, we call back to the other side and we say, hey, something's broke, fix it. No, what we do is we request a retransmission of either a missing or damaged frame, or packet, if you will. The other thing is the encryption process, all right? I want you to know that Radius does use encryption, but the only thing it encrypts is the password, all right? In TACACS Plus, the entire process, not just the password, but when we set up this stateful or connection-oriented communication, the entire process is encrypted. So, from that aspect, it's seen as a little bit more secure. However, it's more expensive and there's a lot of infrastructure behind it. So, I want you to know that TACACS Plus, one of the big things about it that it brought over the older TACACS is the fact that it supports very modular design, and Cisco made it, and now with an open standard, that you can add plugins, right? You can have your authentication, you can have your authorization, you can have your accounting schemes, but it also allowed you to modularly add in things later. So, let's go ahead and just finally here, just talk about the differences so that you can see them up on the screen. When we look at Radius and we look at TACACS Plus, they both do the same thing. However, the authentication and authorization in TACACS can be separated to more than one device. Because I want you to think about this from a security standpoint. If I can gain access to your authentication and your authorization server, that's pretty big, right? But if I separate those servers, I can add another complexity that would make it a little bit harder for the attackers, right? You might get into the authentication server, but maybe you don't get into the authorization server. So again, from a security standpoint, if you are separating those roles, you don't have just a single attack point. Now, another thing here too, when we look at Radius versus TACACS Plus, I mean, Radius is it. That's all you can use. TACACS Plus allowed you the ability, if you wanted, to do multi-protocol support. Again, it is not as widely adopted by any means as Radius is. And that's also due to the less complexities, the reduced complexities of setting it up. Again, remember that Radius uses UDP, connectionless, right, protocol. It only encrypts the password. TACACS Plus uses full process encryption, full encryption, end-to-end encryption for the whole entire process. Finally, I want you to remember, one is an open standard, and really technically TACACS Plus today is kind of an open standard, but TACACS started out as a proprietary. And anytime you have some kind of open standard that you don't, I mean, think about why we use standardization to begin with, right? Standardization allows an interoperability a lot of times between dissimilar systems. If you have a proprietary standard, you get vendor locked. Well, I got to buy your equipment. I wanted to implement this, but I can only buy it for you, from that company. So understand the difference there. Originally it was proprietary versus an open standard, which is why Radius is a little bit more popular today. That is your remote access dial-in user service and your terminal access controller, access control system plus.
All right. Well, that's a great way to think about this, because they basically are doing the same kind of activity, but putting those differences side by side can really help solidify that information on, oh, if I was asked a question on these types of protocols, which one might this be? I can see those differences a whole lot easier than I could see the similarities in my mind. So great stuff there. Now we understand a little bit more about Radius and TACACS and how we would want to use them if we were to implement one of those things. And better yet, we have the information we need to be successful in the exam booth. That being said, we are done for this episode. We're going to call it a day, put a pin in it, but we have more to come in the Security Plus series. So be sure to join us then. That being so, I want to call it a day. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.